Okay. Well, we had a little bit of a delay this morning, but we came off a very, very interesting keynote speaker. So thank you to Adam and the conference chairs for getting us started today and also inviting us to this special panel on startups born from university research. So all right. So I am Natalie Scala. I'm from Towson University. I am a full professor in the College of Business. I am also a cyber security or cyber fellow in the Center for Interdisciplinary and Innovative Cybersecurity at Towson. My work looks on taking complex, high stakes systems and making them actually work in the real world. So today's panel is about what happens when cybersecurity research, often connected to defense, moves out of the lab and into practice as a company. So we have a lot of technical challenges, we have institutional challenges, we have funding, and we have real users. So let's talk about what the process actually looks like. Okay. So we'll start by going through our panelists today. We'll have everyone introduce themselves. Tell me a little bit about your company and a quick note about how your path led you to building the company.
You want to pick someone to start?
Good. Go ahead, Norman.
Sure. I'm Norman Sadeh. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon. I work in cybersecurity, privacy, and responsible AI. And I believe I'm here because of a company I started in 2008 called Wombat Security Technologies. It's a company that grew out of research funded by the National Science Foundation and the DoD ARO. And it focused on combating semantic attacks. It started in 2004, 2005. We could see that those phishing attacks were going to only continue to grow, and we wanted to see if we could come up with a solution that was different from what was being offered in industry at the time. We basically stated that instead of viewing the user as the enemy, perhaps the user could be part of the solution. And so we developed a whole suite of products, or at the time, research prototypes that we evaluated rigorously, including tools such as tools to send fake phishing emails in people's inbox to show them that even though they thought they knew what a phishing email was, they would still potentially fall for one, and that they needed better training. And the results of that research were very compelling. We're achieving a much better performance in terms of getting people to pay attention, to learn the right things, to protect themselves better. And little bit by little bit, we got interest from different organizations saying, hey, that looks pretty interesting. We would be interested in trying that. And I had several other collaborators at Carnegie Mellon that I worked on this research with. But I was the one who stood out as the person who was most motivated from an entrepreneurial standpoint. I had also more experience in that area. And so my co-founders, Lori Trainer and Jason Hong, as well as other faculty who had contributed to research, allowed me to take the lead. They were a little skeptical about the idea, but they said, Norman, if you think this is the way to go for it. And so I grew the company. I was the founding CEO of the company, remained as chairman and chief scientist until the acquisition in 2018. To keep a long story short, we basically created a segment in the cybersecurity market that did not exist before, one that focused on the human element. That segment is worth billions of dollars today. By the time we sold the company, we had 2,000 corporate customers. And that was about 15 to 20 million employees that were relying on our tools to protect themselves. We had been ranked in the Deloitte Fortune 500 for 3 years in a row. We're the leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant that had been created for the area for 4 years in a row. We had about 220 employees, about 200 in Pittsburgh, 20 in London, and a few other satellite offices. And the company that acquired us for about $250 million is Proofpoint. We became central to the products and what this company has positioned itself as. In 2021, Proofpoint was acquired by Thoma Bravo for $12.1 billion, and we continue to do very well. Our tools remain at the core of their product line and are being used by tens of millions of users, many of the Fortune 1000 companies. We're going to keep it at that, but hopefully we can dig deeper later. But I want to give everybody else a chance to speak.
All right, thank you. And we will go next to Perry.
Hi, my name is Perry Alexander, and I've done 2 startups actually. I was founder of Cadstone LLC in the early part of the 2000s, and most recently, I'm co-founder of Invery LLC. Cadstone looked at design languages and system level design kinds of things and tried to have an impact on the chip design community. Invery is a different animal, and it looks at Linux kernel measurement kinds of things. The first company was a success in the sense that nobody lost money, and I learned that I'm not a CEO. And the second company is doing much better because I learned that I'm not a CEO. And I would say that that's probably the smartest thing I did was go out and start working with someone who is good at that. Got to this point by I have across the street almost from me a technology transfer center for KU that makes it really simple to start companies from research that we do, or I should say simple, relatively simple. It's still a complex and difficult process, but I also I think I'm a little bit different in that Invery sells product that is based on technology that's owned by the NSA, which changes things a little bit, but not that much. But I'll just leave it there.
Great, and we'll go to Ariana next.
Hi, folks. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Great. My name is Ariana. I am a co-founder over at BeeSafe. We are relatively early. We have been a company for a couple months now, and this was born out of the research question focusing around like pig butchering and conversational scams. And so, these texts that many of us have gotten that are like, "Hey, John, have you fixed the reservation for tonight?" And you're like, "This isn't John. This is Ariana. Who are you talking about?" It turns out this is a new form of cybercrime that leads to this type of fraud called authorized push payment fraud. There's a lot of technical difficulties. It spans multiple different platforms. And so from a research perspective, we were like, can we build a system that engages with these attackers to figure out where they are trying to move money, what is their infrastructure, etc. And the long story short was yes. And so part of the reason to take the research outside of academia into its standalone entity was because we took some of the data from our pilot, went to a couple partners, both in the financial and government agency sector, and we're like, "Hey, is this data of use to you?" And they're like, "This is very useful to us. How much more data can you get us and when?" And we were all very excited to build a company that outside of the confines of academia that was addressing a real world problem that a lot of people are feeling the pain of today. Prior to that, I did my PhD at UCSD. I've been working in cybersecurity for about 13 years now. And then in between my PhD and my current stint, I worked at a different cybersecurity startup. So a little bit on the earlier side of things compared to Perry and Norman, but excited to be here and share that experience as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Brad, go ahead next, please.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. Hey guys, I'm Brad. Did my PhD at Vanderbilt. Went to hang out in the government a little bit from Johns Hopkins APL. And around COVID timeframe, started getting the startup bug. Wanted to kind of see sunlight again and really kind of take a lot of the research that I've been working on and make an impact in industry. And so what we do, we're a little farther along in Ariana, but not as far as Norman and Perry. But we basically do preemptive security for ransomware defense in AI threats. So with things like Mythos, with things like, next generation exploits that we're seeing, we're focusing on kind of moving the industry from reactive EDR approaches to more categorical preemptive protections that stop the vulnerability class itself versus kind of reacting after the fact. So it's definitely been a ride. Kind of moved between Boston, California, got a lot of great CISO partners and customers. But it's definitely been a really exciting journey going from kind of academia to government to now kind of getting out in the world.
Great. And I had a lot of feedback when I started the panel. So if it was a little awkward for the users, I'll just kind of repeat a little bit about who I am. I am Natalie Scala. I am a professor at Towson University in the College of Business and Economics. I am also a fellow in the Center for Interdisciplinary and Innovative Cybersecurity at Towson. And I also recently founded my own startup, Sunrise Scientific LLC, and we focus mostly on civic tech and app engagement to help people access democracy, help people access government functions, and improve their lives basically. So because I'm at a university and I kind of went through that whole, like Perry mentioned, the invention disclosure and the tech transfer piece and things like that, one of the questions I want to ask is, what role did your university play? And I acknowledge that not everybody came straight from a university into this, but what role did the university play, and how did you realize it was time to form a company? So, a lot of us here at HoTSoS have really good ideas. This is the science of cybersecurity. We're all innovative. So how do you know when it's time to become a company? And your university, what role do they play, or a mentorship if you're outside of the university?
Yeah, I guess I'll go. So for me, it was kind of like a natural kind of progression. So, I did my PhD, finished that, wrote the dissertation, and kind of was looking at, well, how do I make an impact in the world? And so really, it wasn't necessarily like, hey, I'm taking the research and doing the PhD, but it's more of like kind of this trickling in and this trickling kind of itch to like get out there and try to make an impact. So, after a couple years, I started kind of seeing more and more of the problems. And I think the PhD, and Ariana might be able to hit on this too, but it really teaches you how to look at a problem and how to find a problem and how to break it down into small subsets on how to solve it. And it's a similar process for entrepreneurship. You look at industry, you do customer discovery, and then you figure out what are the real issues facing, the CISOs out there. And then from there, you kind of identify, gaps and whether there's parallels with what you're working on and what you worked on in the past. And then you kind of put two and two together and you're like, okay, I'm onto something. And that's kind of what motivates you to kind of put your skin in the game.
Happy to talk about my perspective, if that's okay. So I've always been interested in starting companies. The first thing I did after finishing my PhD in computer science at CMU is I joined the faculty there, but I also took the entrepreneurship program at the business school. So that was always something I wanted to do. And over the years, I've transferred technology in many different ways. Sometimes I've just licensed technologies. Sometimes I've had PhD students hired by a company who just went on and re-implemented things. We've published papers. I've done consulting. But starting a company is always something that I think about when I do research in general. But I also try to be very selective. I've started a few companies, and so I know how painful it can be. Wombat is my success story, but I've also had some failures. And so I learned to be very careful. So the one thing that led us to start Wombat was a combination of factors. One is that there were companies approaching us, interested in licensing the technology from Carnegie Mellon. And that was an interesting indicator. The main question, obviously, in entrepreneurship is to always know what, or at least try to figure what the size of the addressable market is and what the competition is. And it was a very interesting moment because we were still being dismissed by the majority of players in this area. The only companies that were operating in the sector that we were going to enter, the sector of training people not to fall for various types of attacks, was a mom and pop's sort of landscape, with the largest companies perhaps having $1 million or so in sale. And it struck me that this market could potentially be a lot larger, that there were opportunities to consolidate, and that we could build on some of the initial tools and technologies we developed at Carnegie Mellon. And so it's that combination of factors that led me to say, hey, I think there's an opportunity here. We should go ahead and start. And so in my case, at least in the context of Wombat, that was the trajectory, if you will. And very quickly, we started selling. We actually grew the company organically initially. 2008 was, we incorporated in June of 2008. As you know, by September, October of 2008, the economy was tanking. Nobody wanted to invest anymore. So even though I had lined up some investors, they all disappeared on me. So we had to grow the company organically, and it was actually a blessing in disguise. It was painful, but it forced me to sell from the beginning. And there's nothing I can recommend more to any entrepreneur than to say, look at what you've got, turn it to an MVP, and sell as quickly as possible. And so by August of 2008, I had my first customer, and it continued to grow from there. You're mute. Natalie, you're mute right now.
Yeah, would anybody else like to chime in on this question?
Sure. As I said, I've done this twice. And the first time around, we were doing a systems level design language called Rosetta that was designed to be kind of the next VHDL. And the only way we were going to get uptake for that was to engage industry. And industry is not going to, they're not going to rest their company on university grade tools. So the natural thing to do when we got to the point where we needed to engage industry and go into standards was to have a commercial entity. So the university was quite helpful. The university, I was very lucky to work literally in a technology transfer lab. So we had that mission, and we had in-house legal and in-house intellectual property kinds of folks to help with that process. So I learned a ton. As I said, I unfortunately didn't learn until later that I was not a CEO. But the second go around, and I'll come back to that sometime in a minute if anyone's interested. But the second time around was a little bit more interesting. It was I was working with sponsors at the agency, and we had a capability that they were really struggling to get transferred. We knew that there was a commercial market for the ELKIM, the Linux kernel integrity measurement capability, but for whatever reason, getting it transferred was difficult. I mentioned that we have a different now technology transfer organization, and I approached them about working with NSA to build Invery. I also had another mission here, and that is that we're trying to build, Lawrence is a small college town in Kansas, and we're trying to build an ecosystem for entrepreneurship, for spinning out university research. It's one of the goals that we have, and kind of doing that was something that certainly the university wanted me to do and encouraged me to do. The university didn't give me as much help the second time around, but that was okay because we had this fantastic technology transfer organization that was a university community partnership that helped me out quite a lot.
Nice. Okay. Ariana, did you want to weigh in? Okay. All right. So the next kind of question we want to talk about, and I think Norman and Perry touched on it just a little bit, so we'll pick up from it, is, how did you convince your first users to trust your product and moving that defense-related research into broader use?
It's a very good question. And so in our case, I don't know, I hope I hope I'm not short-circuiting anybody here by jumping in first. In our case, we were offering several solutions that were fairly original. The idea that you should phish your employees, which has become the de facto standard nowadays to try and train people to not fall for phishing attacks. Back in 2008, that really required people who were willing to think out of the box. And there were not that many of them. But fortunately enough, we had some fairly high-profile publications. Carnegie Mellon helped us publicize the results that we had. And so we had a few early adopters that approached us and expressed interest in trying our technologies. And so in the early days, even though I bragged about having my first sale within 2 months, those sales were coming in a trickle, right? So it's not like I had tens of sales every month or anything like that. It was a sale per month or something like that, and that was enough to keep the lights on. And all my employees initially were part-time, and then little bit by little bit, we gained traction because people noticed that, hey, these results, are real. We were getting a few customers, not all of them, to agree to publicize the fact that they were actually using your technology. Not everybody, especially when you sell to government, not everybody is willing to let you do that. But we had some customers, big brands, that said, hey, if you want to, publish those results, go ahead. We're okay with that. And I think that got us credibility over time. And so the first few years were relatively slow growth that enabled us to beef up the family of products that we had, the product suite that we had. And that worked out very nicely. And then eventually we reached a point where I had hired a few professional salespeople. I was no longer closing all the sales myself. And we had come to the point where it looked like we had a process that could be documented, that could be reproduced. We understood what the parameters were, and the VCs with just the right amount of revenue to interest VCs. And so we went beyond the initial series of seed funding, go to Series A, and that's where you sort of go up the hockey stick and you just go, pedal to the metal, as they say, right? So you try to accelerate as much as possible. We grew the sales force from a few people to over 100 employees by the time we sold the company.
Yeah, I can jump in and add my perspective as well. What's been really useful, and I think this is true for any company, even those outside of the cybersecurity and defense space, is really being able to listen and hear your customers' pain points because they're having difficulties, which is why you're talking to them. But the way that the solution may need to manifest for them or may manifest for a smaller organization in a specific vertical versus a larger organization in the same vertical may look slightly differently. And so for us, like we are data experts, AI experts, and so we're good at collecting this data, but the solutions look slightly different for different customers. And so it's really, and going back to Brad's point, like putting on that problem solving hat, going and doing this customer validation across whatever your verticals are, even across the different sizes, because it can look very different, and truly hearing what they're saying. Because, I can even say for us, we've been surprised of like, oh, this is the form in which they want the product and the solution. That's not something I would have hypothesized, but that's super useful to know. And now we can go and like do that and execute that and help that customer in the way that they need. So to add on to that, that's been very useful for us as well. And again, I think is a philosophy that helps startups across all different types, not just cybersecurity.
So we had an interesting challenge, both a challenge and it is two-edged sword, in that we were working with NSA provided technology. We had customers who believed in what we were doing more because we're selling a cybersecurity product that, although it wasn't backed by the agency, of course they can't do that, but had that provenance. Then again, I had a collection of customers that would not deal with it because it was code that came out of the agency, and felt like that there was some mystical dust that was sprinkled on the code that made it bad in some way. So, but that didn't happen very often, I have to say. But it was interesting and something I didn't expect. When we started trying to get people to trust us, so to speak, is what we had to do was basically do demonstrations and go on the road. And our CEO spent a lot of time, and CTO spent a lot of time on the road, talking to people, showing the product. And I made the comment that I'm a bad CEO. I've made that several times. This is when that manifests itself. If you ask me, does product A or does program A do thing X, I am going to hem and haw and explain to you all the ins and outs and how I did my analysis. My CEO will say, yes, I can't do that. That's not the way I think. So having confidence in the product and being able to to be a marketing person, to be quite honest, was what we needed. And as I said, it's just, and I'm sure everyone on the panel feels the same way. Putting something out in front of a collection of customers is a very different thing than putting something out in front of NSF. It's a completely different process. I thought the first go around that it was similar. I have this really good technology. My sponsors like it. My customers will like it. Not at all. It's a very different process. I would also say the other thing that makes it different is it's open-ended. In other words, when we do proposals, we have dates when our proposal is submitted. We have dates when the decision is made. That's not true in the commercial space. They can do things on their own timeline, and getting someone to commit is just a very different process. So I guess in a nutshell, nothing beats getting out and going to talk to potential customers and listening to them and incorporating what they tell you into the things that you do.
Yep, and if I can add one thing, and Perry did a pretty good job of hitting on this. When you go with your first customers, there's a famous saying called founder-led sales, which basically means that everybody's in sales. So even though, I'm the CTO and I'm the guy who built the technology, right, I have to also be the guy who talks to the customers, who forms the partnerships, who learns marketing. And when I kind of went through that process, number one, we kind of start with like advisors in our network to kind of get those initial customers. But when you start talking to these people, you start realizing that it's not necessarily a technical value proposition, it's a people value proposition. So these are real people with real problems who are trying to operate their own businesses. And so in our world, which is like ransomware, right? A lot of times when we talk to people, it's their worst day, right? Like their whole thing that they worked for 10 plus years is now potentially going to go bankrupt. And so I learned really quickly that it's great if we build a good technology, but really the point is kind of take it to the next level where you're building the technology to help the person. And so when we write for NSF or these grants, right, it's like we build this great technology, but when you see the look on someone's face when you literally save their company, that's what makes it worthwhile.
So just one quick thing, what Brad said reminded me, there's a saying that I heard, we move at the speed of trust. And as your customers establish trust with you, that's I think what causes your company to move. And Brad just touched on that in spades. Brad's saying that some days the day you see somebody is their worst day. Absolutely. And when you can come in and solve their problem, you're establishing trust.
So if I can add something, I think we're all in agreement here that one important thing as a founder in a company is to understand who you are, what your strengths are. If you're not good at selling, make sure that you're ready to find people who can help you with that. Don't try to do everything yourself, even though you may be very short on resources initially. And talking to customers, nothing beats that. Understanding the needs, segmenting the market, understanding differences between different verticals, as Ariana said. This is all critical, and then prioritizing, because typically you have very limited resources.
All right. We probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So I will ask this one. What did you think would be easy, but then it wasn't? And I think Barry touched on that a little bit. I'm not the CEO, right? The selling part. But from everyone's unique experience, what did you expect would roll and then didn't?
Yeah. So I think doubling down on selling. So, I'm kind of coming in, I'm like, I built this great technology, guys. And then, I'm expecting everybody, all the investors liked it, all like, the advisors liked it. And I went to the customers, I'm like, look, I built this great technology. But then I learned definitely really quickly, again, that people problem. It's great technology, but how does it help the CISO? And so really we built this technology, but ransomware was the problem. And so we learned about how to pivot our messaging to the business value proposition. So how can they save money? How can they have less stress? That's ultimately what they're trying to find. The other part is scaling. So you build your product, you build your first customers, and then you inherently think that, I'll worry about the whole infrastructure later on. Well, when you go to these big enterprises with 50,000, 60,000, 100,000 endpoints, there's always something that goes wrong. And so really thinking about upfront, how do I kind of methodologically, scale my infrastructure, scale my team, from customer support, from, the people that kind of make sure the customers are happy, that pays dividends later on. Because if you can, make sure everything goes smoothly at scale, that's how your company succeeds.
Ditto. Wow. Yeah. So the scaling thing, I talked about hiring a CEO. The one thing that CEO brings me more than anything else is having scaled up solutions for Lowe's and having scaled up solutions for other companies, Matterport. But that's absolutely right. And I had no clue what it meant to try to scale up, not just a programming group, but all the other stuff, the selling, the management, all that kind of stuff. The other thing that I struggled with, and I still don't like very well, to be honest, is your investors could care less about the technology. They want to make money. That's what they're trying to do. And that's their job, and I understand that. But I've had to get past the idea that my investors, they care about the company, they care about us, but ultimately they don't care about the technology. And they will take the company in the direction that makes them money rather than necessarily the direction that makes you technically happy.
Definitely. So from my perspective, I don't know that I can single out one particular challenge, but one thing that certainly applied to my 10 years as a co-founder and chairman of my company was the need to constantly rethink my role within the company, try to identify those things who are still needed, and be willing to delegate and bring in other people to help. As you scale over time, there are lots of meetings that you can no longer afford to attend, that you should not be attending. Always make sure to surround yourself by people who know things that you don't know. Be willing to trust them over time and delegate. And so I had to redefine my role every year as the company grew, and that was actually very interesting. I learned a ton in the process. There were things that I knew nothing about. Like we acquired a competitor at some point. I had never done that. Fortunately enough, we had a CFO, so board members with experience with this, bringing that company on board successfully. Eventually working with investment bankers to sell the company. All these things were things I had never done, and I was lucky enough to have good people around me that I could rely on. And so being able to just listen to these people, establish a trust relationship with them, I don't think that it was a challenge per se, but it was certainly something that required a different attitude than being the know-it-all professor that I usually am at Carnegie Mellon.
Yeah, and just echoing what Brad said, I think one of the things that has been the most surprising has been the sales, and we've been very fortunate in a lot of our efforts and pushing things forward. But being able to be flexible in people's asks and move quickly and work along their different processes, because some people want a pilot, some people want a POC. Like everyone is just a little different for you to get to that signature of like, okay, now we're in an agreement for X months for Y dollars, has been very much like the largest learning experience that I've had thus far. And it's been fun.
Okay. All right. So we have a little over 5 minutes left. So I'm going to kind of go to a closing question, and then we can open to more general if we have time. But what is the one thing the cybersecurity research community should do differently if we want that real world impact? As we've talked a little bit today about, this is different than NSF, when we're all making impacts through our foundational cybersecurity research, we're making impacts sometimes in policy as well with this research. But when we get it out into industry, which, Perry has said that sometimes, people see the code where they're backed from, and maybe it's sprinkled with chaos or whatever. Moving into that, how do we move this foundational research, and what should we do differently to get that real world impact?
So I would say the first thing we need to do is collectively we need to be less incremental in our research. I think I see way too much incremental research today. If you're going to start a company, you've got to be different. Unless you're a really, really unique faculty who's got amazing business skills, you've got to realize that you're going to be competing with people who are more skilled than you are as far as running a business is concerned. And so your edge has to be in the form of a solution that's very different from what can be found elsewhere in a marketplace. You need to have something that's going to give you room to make some errors along the way. You've got to be the one company that's offering something that nobody else offers. And so that has to drive your research in the first place. Don't try to just write another paper. Try to take some risk in your research. Try to do things that are very different. Try to think about things, from a different perspective. That's only part of the answer, but I'm going to leave it at that. I'm sure others will add more color to this answer.
Okay.
Or not.
But one thing that I thought of, that I have thought of for most of my career, and actually made me, perhaps a little bit of an oddball during my PhD, is what are the problems that we can be solving today? And sometimes those aren't necessarily novel things or have novel solutions, but there are a lot of real world problems that are really, really quite difficult. And putting a research lens to like, hey, what are my family members experiencing? What are the people in my life experiencing with regards to cybersecurity? I think could really help move the needle. I'm also showing my bias as like my background's in more human-centered large-scale data analytics. But this has always been the question that I've thought of. And so, I always like to encourage people who are especially interested in getting out of academia and more into the industry or entrepreneurial space to think about what are the problems that people are facing today, like right now, that you could try and solve with your research, with your technology, et cetera.
I think in cybersecurity, we face a problem that no one wants our stuff. I mean, no one wants to pay for cybersecurity. I mean, you don't pay an extra $5 when you get your cell phone for the more secure cell phone. It doesn't work that way. So convincing people that there's a need for our work without frightening them. One of the things I'm very, very adamant about is if somebody's trying to scare you, don't buy what they're selling. So I think establishing that people need our work without horrifying them, and convincing them that the problems that we face, they're not going away, and that there really is a need for what we do. The other thing I see a lot is the most horrifying thing I can do is look at my parents' cell phones. I see Ariana smiling. I look at my parents' cell phones and I see the result of what marketing in the cybersecurity arena has done, and that needs to go away. I think we need to be better at policing that, but I'm not sure how to do that. So convincing people that they really do, our stuff has value and it's worthwhile, I think is important. And it's different than selling the next Flappy Birds or whatever other iPhone widget you might sell.
So, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So when you think about kind of doing your research in academia, I think one of the things that I've been particularly interested in, even going back to my PhD, was the interdisciplinary approach. So not only do you kind of have cyber guys with human factors people, with psychologists, with biologists, we traditionally think of that as like the most optimal way to do research. But the other angle that I've seen more and more, but I want to kind of reiterate on, is the private partnerships. So being able to have industry come in and also be a part of that team, because those are the people that are on the front lines and they see the day-to-day needs of the customer. And all of the research projects that I've seen that have that model, I believe are the most kind of impactful from the societal portion of it. The other part is thinking of the practical, again, like the problem, always being problem centric and problem focused. So when you're doing your research, think of, I know someone mentioned, what's important today, but I like to think of what's important in like 5 to 10 years. But it's not necessarily, kind of like theoretical 5 to 10 years, but like if you kind of think back, like what are the problems today and how do you see them progressing? That's kind of, what I see is like the best way to kind of, get ahead of the curve, do research with that in mind, that 5 years from now, you'll have a mature technology that you can deploy in the field.
Okay, Norman, did you want to add? We have like a 2-minute warning. So Norman, would you like to add that last comment?
I wanted to make sure that we uttered one word that nobody has uttered so far. I think Perry is the one who got closest, and it's ROI, right? So return on investment. If you want to sell to customers, you've got to show them an ROI. And as it turns out, there's obviously a very naive way in cybersecurity to come up with an ROI, and the number is infinite. It's like, this could kill your company, therefore you need to buy, my product. The problem is that every vendor can make that statement, and that doesn't really help when it comes to prioritizing what they're going to spend their money on. And so you need to take a much more modest and realistic view of what it takes to compute an ROI, ignore some of the biggest risks, and focus on the more tangible and mundane risks, such as, fixing a machine, cleaning up a machine, the time it's going to take for employees, right, to basically, reset things after an incident. And if you can show a very significant ROI just based on that, then you're going to be in a much, much better position to sell your product. In our case, with phishing at Wombat, our ROI was 2 or 3 months, and it was basically time to clean up the machines, time to cook for these employees who are involved in doing that. That by itself was sufficient to justify buying our products. And so that's a different way of thinking, but that's, I think, can make a big difference also when it comes to selling a product.
Well, we are about time today. There was a couple questions that came in from the viewers today too, but I don't think we'll have quite some time to connect with those yet.